Welcome to Founding Chronicles, the place where we uncover the forgotten and hidden stories of America's past. If you love history, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you never miss the stories that shaped our nation. Now let's begin. It began quietly, the way so many tragedies in American history do. There was no single explosion, no headline that shook the country awake in one night. Instead, it was a slow and cruel theft, repeated again and again, tucked away behind hospital walls and the doors of state institutions. Thousands of babies disappeared, their cries silenced not by death, but by the cold machinery of a black market that called itself adoption. For many years in the mid-20th century, especially from the 1920s through the 1950s, America was swept into a storm of social shame, secrecy, and misplaced morality. To be an unwed mother in those decades was to carry a scar that society refused to forgive. Communities whispered, churches condemned, families turned cold. In a world that prized appearances above truth, young women who found themselves pregnant without a husband were often treated as if they had committed the worst sin imaginable. Hospitals, orphanages, and maternity homes quickly became warehouses of shame, where frightened young mothers were hidden away until their babies were born. But what happened to those babies was far worse than silence or secrecy. In Tennessee, in Georgia, in Mississippi, and across the nation, the cries of newborns were not heard by their mothers, but were instead claimed by doctors, nurses, social workers, and agencies who saw not human lives, but prophets. There was one name whispered with particular bitterness by survivors, Georgia Tann. She ran the Tennessee Children's Home Society from Memphis, and for more than 2 decades, she turned child trafficking into an industry. Well-dressed and polite, Tann fooled judges, politicians, and wealthy families alike. She posed as a savior of children, but behind her neat appearance was a ruthless dealer. She did not save children. She stole them. A young mother might go into a hospital in Memphis, exhausted from labor, begging to hold her newborn. But instead of being placed in her arms, the baby was carried away. Nurses would tell her the child had died, that she should not ask questions, that God had taken her baby. No death certificate was given. No funeral. Just a gaping silence. The mother would leave broken and ashamed, carrying the weight of a loss she did not understand. But in truth, her child was alive, packed into a car and driven away to be sold to strangers who had the money and the social standing to pay. Tann's reach was vast. Records later revealed that she placed more than 5,000 children, many of them stolen, into homes across America. Her network stretched into California, New York, and beyond. She targeted not only unwed mothers, but also poor families, sometimes arriving at a home with local police, declaring the parents unfit, and seizing children who cried and clung to their mother's skirts. Poverty was treated as a crime, and the punishment was the theft of a child. But how could such an operation survive for so long? The answer lies in the moral codes of the time and the willingness of people in power to look away. Adoption was still a new and somewhat unregulated idea in early 20th century America. For wealthy couples unable to have children, the promise of a baby healthy, white, and presented with papers that seemed official was irresistible. Politicians, judges, and doctors were often eager to help, blinded by the idea that these children were being rescued from unworthy homes. It is hard for us today to understand the silence that allowed this to continue. But in those decades, speaking out carried great risks. Mothers who lost babies were too ashamed to fight back, terrified of being branded forever as immoral. Families who suspected foul play often lacked the money or influence to challenge institutions. And for the children themselves, many grew up never knowing they had been stolen, raised to believe their adoptive story was one of rescue, not of theft. Imagine for a moment a young girl in 1945, born to a poor farm family in Tennessee. She is taken at 2 years old, handed to a wealthy couple from Los Angeles. She grows up under palm trees, wearing nice dresses, eating well. Yet deep inside her, she feels the wound of abandonment she cannot explain. Her adoptive parents, loving in their own way, never tell her the truth. Decades later, she discovers that her birth mother never abandoned her at all, but fought to keep her until the law, the courts, and the Tennessee Children's Home Society ripped them apart. The reunion, if it comes, is haunted by time lost in years that cannot be reclaimed. The story of America's black market. Adoptions is not just about one woman, though Tan remains its most infamous face. Across the country, in maternity homes run by churches and charities, young women were pressured to give up their babies. They were told it was the moral thing, the only way to protect themselves and their child from the stain of illegitimacy. Many never signed papers willingly. They were tricked, coerced, or simply ignored. Babies were funneled into agencies that made money by supplying desperate adoptive families. And so the cycle continued. Secrecy, shame, and stolen lives. What makes this history even more chilling is that many of the stolen babies were not treated with care once they were taken. Reports later surfaced of children neglected, abused, or dying in the hands of the Tennessee Children's Home Society before they were sold. Photographs from the time show pale, malnourished toddlers, their eyes empty, their tiny bodies fragile from hunger. For every child who ended up in a comfortable home, there were others who never lived to see their second birthday. The cruelty hid behind a mask of respectability. Georgia Tan mingled with judges, sat with governors, and was praised in newspapers as a woman who solved the orphan problem. Few dared to question her methods, and those who did were often silenced. Money flowed in all directions, from adoptive parents to agencies, from agencies to officials who looked the other way. Corruption, secrecy, and misplaced ideals of morality created the perfect storm that allowed the black market adoption trade to thrive for decades. But secrets cannot remain buried forever. By the late 1940s, whispers had turned into accusations, and the truth about the stolen babies began to rise. Investigators started piecing together records, and families came forward with stories that did not add up. The facade of charity began to crack, exposing the darker truth beneath Dot, and as the light finally turned toward the Tennessee Children's Home Society, Americans were confronted with a question that cut deep into the heart of their country. How could a nation that prided itself on family values allow thousands of its most vulnerable children to be stolen and sold in plain sight? The unraveling began in whispers, but soon those whispers grew too loud to ignore. By the late 1940s, the walls that had protected the black market adoption system began to crumble. Families who had been told their babies had died started to notice strange details. Hospital records vanished. Death certificates were missing. Nurses who had once been complicit, driven by guilt, began to talk in hushed voices about what they had seen. And at the center of it all was Georgia Tan and the Tennessee Children's Home Society. Tan's empire had grown too large, too bold. For decades, she had operated with near total control, her methods shielded by a cloak of respectability. She knew the right judges, the right lawyers, the right politicians. She had built friendships with governors. She had been praised in magazines and newspapers as a savior of children. But even the most carefully built facade cannot stand forever. The first real cracks appeared when adoptive families began to notice problems with the children they had received. Many were not the healthy, perfect babies Tan had promised. Some were sick, suffering from malnutrition, disease, or past neglect. Others carried scars, physical and emotional, that spoke of rough handling and cruel separations. Still others died young, leaving behind grieving adoptive parents who began asking questions. Meanwhile, Poor families who had lost children kept telling their stories, though few wanted to hear them. Mothers swore their babies had been alive and healthy when taken, only to be told hours later that the child had died. Fathers described sheriffs arriving at their doors with papers declaring them unfit, their children ripped from their arms by force. To many in power, these were just the complaints of the poor, dismissed as exaggeration. But the voices did not fade. They grew louder. It was in 1949 that the weight of the truth finally broke through. Tennessee's governor at the time, Gordon Browning, launched an investigation into Tan's operations. What his investigators found was a trail of fraud, corruption, and cruelty so vast it shocked even hardened officials. Tan had stolen or brokered the adoption of more than 5,000 children. She had falsified birth certificates, lied to judges, and sold babies to wealthy families for sums as high as $5,000, a staggering amount in those days. The scandal spread across the nation. Families in California, New York, and Texas discovered their adoptions were tainted by Tan's deception. Some adoptive parents, horrified by the revelations, tried to learn the truth of their children's origins. Others refused to believe it, clinging to the comfort of the story they had been told. And for the birth mothers, the exposure of the scheme was both a vindication and a new wound. Many learned, decades too late, that the babies they had mourned were not dead at all, but living under new names, in new families, with no memory of them. The human cost was unbearable. Imagine a woman who had been told in 1932 that her newborn had died. For 17 years she carried that grief, burying it deep because society demanded her silence. Then, in 1949, she read in the newspaper that babies had been stolen and sold, that her story matched countless others, that the child she had believed gone forever might still be alive. The mixture of hope and heartbreak was almost too much to bear, but there was little justice to be had. Georgia Tan herself never faced trial. The investigation revealed her crimes, but before she could be fully prosecuted, she died of cancer in September 1950. Death spared her from punishment, and with her passing, many of the secrets she carried went to the grave. Records had been destroyed. Names changed. The paper trail of thousands of stolen lives vanished in smoke. For the children caught in the middle, the truth brought more confusion than clarity. Some learned in adulthood that they had been stolen, their identities rewritten by a woman who saw them as property. They wrestled with the pain of being separated from their birth families, even as they felt loyalty to the parents who had raised them. Others never learned the full truth. Their pasts erased so thoroughly that even the investigation could not restore them. The scandal rocked Tennessee and the nation, but it was only the beginning of America's reckoning with its adoption practices. Tan had been the boldest, the most infamous, but she was not the only one. Across the country, in Catholic maternity homes, Protestant institutions, and government-run facilities, similar stories played out. Young women were pressured, shamed, and coerced into giving up their babies. Adoption agencies thrived on secrecy, promising fresh starts while burying the truth. The public began to ask questions, but the answers were slow to come. Adoption reform would take decades, with laws gradually shifting to provide more oversight and protection. Yet even as reforms were debated, the damage had already been done. Thousands of lives were permanently altered, families ripped apart, and a shadow was cast over what should have been an act of compassion. There was another layer to the scandal, one that revealed how deeply corruption had poisoned the system. Tan's power did not come from charm alone. She had paid off judges to look the other way, to sign off on adoptions without proper consent. She had lined the pockets of lawyers and officials who stood to gain from her business. She had built her empire not only on the suffering of mothers and children, but on the greed of men sworn to uphold the law. And the cruelty was not limited to deception. Investigators uncovered stories of children left neglected in the Tennessee Children's Home Society, crowded into filthy conditions, underfed, and untreated for illness. Some were beaten. Some died before they could ever be placed, their tiny bodies discarded with little ceremony. For all her polished image as a woman of refinement, Tan had overseen a house of misery. When the scandal finally burst into the open, newspapers across America carried the story. Headlines screamed of stolen babies, illegal adoptions, and corruption at the highest levels of Tennessee's government. For many Americans, it was the first time they realized that adoption, an institution they had thought of as purely charitable, could be twisted into something cruel and predatory. The myth of the noble adoption system cracked, and behind it lay the faces of thousands of children whose lives had been bought and sold. Yet despite the national outrage, the full truth never reached all the families it needed to. Too many records had been lost. Too many lies told. Too many officials eager to sweep the scandal away once Tan was dead. For the mothers who had lost babies, closure rarely came. For the children, their identities remained scattered like ashes, impossible to gather back into one whole story. And so the question lingered, haunting the halls of memory. How could this have happened in America, the land that prized family and faith? How could so many have been silent while an empire of stolen babies flourished in plain sight? The answers were tangled in shame, greed, and the heavy weight of a culture that punished women for bearing children outside of marriage. Exposure of Georgia Tan's crimes was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning of a reckoning that would take years, decades, and still leave scars today. Because behind every number in the statistics, behind the 5,000 stolen children, was a heartbeat, a mother's tears, a child's lost name. In the years that followed the exposure of Georgia Tan and the Tennessee Children's Home Society, the scandal slipped into the shadows, but it never disappeared. It lingered in whispers, in family secrets, in the aching silence between mothers and children who had been separated by lies. On paper, the case seemed closed. Tan was dead. Her home had been shut down. Politicians congratulated themselves for solving the problem. But for the people whose lives had been torn apart, there was no closure, only scars that could not be healed by headlines. The mothers were perhaps the most silent victims. Many of them had spent years believing their children were dead, mourning babies they had never buried. When the truth emerged, it did not bring peace. Instead, it ripped open old wounds. Some women were haunted by the thought that their sons or daughters were alive somewhere, calling another woman mother. Others could not bear to believe it, convincing themselves the lie had been the truth, because hope was too heavy to carry. For some, the shame of the past, the judgment from family, church, and community kept them from ever speaking out, even when they learned their children might still be alive. And the children, those thousands of stolen babies, carried their own pain. Many grew up in homes that were materially comfortable, yet filled with shadows. They were told they had been chosen, that they were lucky. But deep inside, they felt a gnawing emptiness, a sense that something had been taken from them before they even had words. Some struggled with identity, unable to reconcile the life they were living with the unknown life they had lost. They wondered who they truly were, where they had come from, why the truth had been hidden. For many, the answers would not come until adulthood, if they came at all. When the scandal broke, newspapers printed names and details, but records were scattered, destroyed, or falsified. Some adoptees spent decades searching for their birth families, only to find dead ends. Others stumbled on the truth, by accident a slip of paper, an overheard conversation, a secret finally spoken at a family gathering. Those who were lucky enough to reconnect with their birth families often found joy mixed with sorrow. The years could not be given back. The childhoods lost could not be restored. Reunions were powerful, but they were also fragile. Carrying the weight of decades of absence, America was slow to face the truth. In the 1950s and 1960s, adoption remained wrapped in secrecy. Birth records were sealed. Adoptive parents were told to raise children as if they were their own, with no mention of the past. Mothers were told to move on, to forget, to never speak of the babies they had lost. It was not until the cultural shifts of the 1970s and 1980s, when adoptees began demanding access to their birth records, and mothers began to speak openly about their experiences, that the depth of the wound began to be acknowledged. But the damage of those earlier decades was immense. Families carried hidden grief for generations. In small towns across Tennessee and beyond, stories of lost babies became part of local folklore. Women whispered to each other about the maternity homes where their sisters or cousins had been sent away, never to return with their child. Older relatives carried secrets to their graves, unable to speak of what had happened in their youth. And across America, thousands of men and women lived with the uneasy knowledge that the story they had been told about their birth was not the truth. The black market adoption trade also left its mark on the broader culture. It exposed the deep hypocrisy of a society that claimed to value family and morality, but was willing to destroy poor families to supply children to wealthy ones. It revealed the cruelty of institutions that treated unwed mothers not as women in need of compassion, but as sinners to be punished and hidden away. It showed how easily the powerless could be silenced, and how greed could corrupt even the most sacred of bonds. And it was not only Tennessee. Stories from other states revealed similar patterns. In New York, in Georgia, in Mississippi, maternity homes and orphanages were accused of coercing mothers into surrendering their babies. In some cases, the babies were sold not just to American families, but overseas. The scandal of Georgia Tann was the largest and most infamous, but it was not unique. It was part of a wider culture of secrecy and control that defined adoption in mid-century America. For those who lived through it, the memories remained sharp. Some survivors described the terror of being taken from their birth families. Toddlers who cried and screamed as strangers carried them away. Others remembered the cold walls of the Tennessee Children's Home Society, the hunger, the loneliness, the sense of waiting for something they did not understand. One woman recalled being lined up with other children, made to smile and perform for visiting adoptive parents, as if they were on display in a market. These were not just stories, they were lived realities, carried in the hearts of thousands who had once been children caught in a trade they could not comprehend. By the time America began to reckon with this history, it was already late. Many of the mothers had passed away, never knowing what became of their children. Many of the children had grown old themselves, some choosing to search for their origins, others deciding to leave the past buried. The state of Tennessee eventually issued an apology decades later, acknowledging the cruelty of the system and the suffering it had caused. But apologies, however sincere, could not erase the decades of silence, nor could they bring back what was stolen. Still, the survivors carried on. Some told their stories publicly, writing memoirs, giving interviews, standing as living witnesses to a past that others tried to forget. They wanted the world to know that they were not just numbers in a scandal, but real people with real lives that had been altered forever. Others chose silence, holding their pain close, unable or unwilling to reopen the wounds. Both choices were acts of survival, ways of living with a history that had been forced upon them. The story of America's black market adoptions was not just about crime or scandal. It was about the breaking of the most human bond, the connection between mother and child. And though decades have passed, the echoes of that breaking still sound in families today. For every adoption reunion that brings joy, there are others that bring only confusion, regret, or grief. For every truth uncovered, there are countless others that remain hidden. And yet, In those stories of survival, there is also resilience. Mothers who carried their grief for a lifetime still found ways to live, to love, to carry on. Children who grew up in confusion learned to build their own identities, even when the truth was denied to them. Families torn apart by greed still found ways, sometimes to come back together, proving that love, however delayed, can still endure. The scandal had been exposed, the names printed, the numbers counted. But behind all that, the heart of the story was not finished. Because the past does not simply end, it lingers, shaping the present, reaching into the lives of generations yet unborn. The stolen babies of the black market adoption era carried their scars into adulthood, and their children, and even their grandchildren, felt the ripples. The shame, the secrecy, the longing, it did not stop when Georgia Tann died. It lived on in the quiet spaces of American homes, in the unspoken questions at family tables, in the old photographs tucked into drawers. Even long after the scandal faded from headlines, the ghost of America's black market adoption trade lingered. It lived in old records, in faded photographs, in the faces of men and women who carried questions they could not answer. It lived in the silence of mothers who had been told never to speak, in the careful words of adoptive parents who feared the truth, and in the empty spaces of family trees where branches had been cut away. The story of stolen babies was not just history. It was memory, grief, and a lesson about what happens when society's shame becomes more powerful than its compassion. As decades passed, survivors began to speak. In the 1980s and 1990s, adoptees who had grown up in Georgia Tann's system came forward with their stories. They told of the unease they had always felt, the small cracks in the stories they were told, the hunger to know their beginnings. Some described painful searches, years of writing letters, knocking on doors, begging for access to sealed records. Others told of reunions that came by surprise, a name found in a newspaper, a cousin recognized, a birth mother discovered after half a lifetime apart. The mothers, too, began to speak when the culture shifted enough to allow it. For many, it was the first time they had ever said out loud what had happened to them as young women. They described being pressured by doctors, priests, and social workers to give up their babies. They spoke of being told they were unfit, that they were sinful, that the only way to save their child was to let them go. They spoke of being tricked, told their babies had died, when in truth, those babies were carried away to strangers. The weight of those memories was heavy, but for some, speaking them aloud was the first step toward healing. Yet even as the truth surfaced, it became clear that the damage was too deep to fully repair. For many, the past could not be untangled. Some adoptees discovered their birth families only to find their mothers and fathers had died years earlier, taking the secrets with them. Others reunited only to find relationships strained, haunted by decades of absence. A mother who had lived her whole life believing her baby was dead could not simply step into the role of mom 50 years later. A son who had been raised by another family could not easily accept a stranger as his parent, no matter how strong the blood bond. Love was present, but it was complicated, tangled in loss. Still, there were moments of joy, stories that shone through the darkness. A mother holding her daughter's hand after half a century apart. A brother meeting the sister he never knew existed. A child who grew up believing he was abandoned learning, instead that his mother had fought to keep him. These moments could not erase the past, but they could reclaim a piece of it, giving survivors something that had been denied to them for so long. The truth. The state of Tennessee, after years of silence, eventually admitted its failure. In the late 1990s, officials issued a formal apology to the families and survivors of the Tennessee Children's Home Society. They acknowledged the cruelty of what had happened, the lies, the thefts, the lives broken by greed and secrecy. But apologies could not restore what had been lost. They could only mark the truth, giving it a place in history so that it could not be denied again. What makes this story endure is not just the scale of the crime, but what it reveals about America itself. It shows how deeply the nation once feared shame more than injustice, how it valued appearances over truth, and how easily the powerless could be silenced. It is a story about mothers judged for their poverty or their youth, children reduced to commodities, and institutions that put profit before humanity. But it is also a story about endurance, the way people carried on despite what was taken from them, the way truth eventually broke through the silence, the way love survived even in fractured forms. For many older Americans, this story is not just history, but memory. It reminds them of a time when unwed mothers were hidden away, when families kept secrets in the name of respectability, when the shame of a pregnancy outside of marriage could change a life forever. It brings back the old days of maternity homes run by nuns, of whispered rumors about girls sent away, of neighbors who disappeared for months and came back pretending nothing had happened. The scandal of stolen babies was the most extreme form of that culture, but it grew from the same soil, a soil rich with secrecy and silence. Today, when people look back, the story serves as a warning. It shows the danger of letting institutions act without oversight, of letting prejudice shape policy, of letting shame dictate morality. It reminds us that the bonds of family should never be treated as disposable, and that every child, every mother, every family deserves respect and truth. But beyond the lessons, the heart of the story remains the people, the mothers who cried for babies they never held, the children who grew up without knowing where they came from, the families who pieced themselves back together after decades apart. Their voices, once silenced, now form a chorus across history, saying, "This happened. We lived it. Do not forget." And perhaps that is the final act of justice, not trials, not punishments, not even apologies, but memory itself. By telling the story, by speaking the names, by remembering what was done, America honors those who suffered and ensures that the silence that protected such cruelty can never return. For in the end, history is not just the record of the past. It is the voice of those who were denied the chance to speak when they were alive. And the story of America's stolen babies taken, sold, silence deserves to be heard, told, and remembered for as long as there are families who value truth and love above all else.